everyone, welcome back to my Trip Corner, which is now Norse Pagan Corner. I might go ahead and change the name again, I'm not sure, but for now it's Norse Pagan Corner, so welcome. If you are new, I am reading chapters from this book here. My intention is every time after I read a chapter, I'm going to go ahead and pause before I make the next chapter, or before I read the next chapter, to see if anyone has any questions that they want me to answer or something like that. And if they do, I'll do my best to answer that before I read chapter 2 or the next chapter, whatever that may be. However, nobody has left any comments, so I have no questions to answer. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started with chapter 2. But don't forget to like and subscribe this video. Comment down below if you have any questions about this chapter, or if you're just joining my channel, go ahead and watch the first chapter and then go ahead and watch this one. And if you have any questions from the chapter I'm going to read or the chapter before that, then go ahead and leave comments down below, questions that you may have, and I will do my best to answer them before I read chapter 3. So here we go. Chapter 2, Odin. The father of gods and men. Odin, Wotan, or Woden, was the highest and holiest god of the northern races. He was the all-pervading spirit of the universe, the personification of the air, the god of universal wisdom and victory, and the leader and protector of princes and heroes. As all the gods were supposed to be descended from him, he was surnamed Allfather, and as eldest and chief among them, he occupied the highest seat in Asgard. Known by the name of Hildskjalf, this chair was not only an exalted throne, but also a mighty watchtower, from whence he could overlook the whole world and see at a glance all that was happening among gods, giants, elves, dwarfs, and men. From the hall of heaven he rode away to Hildskjalf and sat upon his throne, the mount from whence his eyes surveyed the world, and far from heaven he turned his shining orbs, to look on Midgard and the earth and men. Balder dead, Matthew Arnold. Odin's personal appearance. Excuse me, sorry, my hair's getting in the way. None but Odin and his wife, Queen Frigga, were privileged to use the seat, and when they occupied it, they generally gazed towards the south and west, the goal of all the hopes and excursions of the northern nations. Odin was generally represented as a tall, vigorous man, about 50 years of age, either with dark curling hair or with a long gray beard and bald head. He was clad in a suit of gray with a blue hood, and his muscular body was enveloped in a wide blue mantle flecked with gray, an emblem of the sky with its fleecy clouds. In his hand, Odin generally carried the infallible spear Gungnir, which was so sacred that an oath sworn upon its point could never be broken, and on his finger or arm he wore the marvelous ring Draupnir, the emblem of fruitfulness, precious beyond compare. When seated upon his throne or armed for the fray, to mingle in which he would often descend to earth, Odin wore his eagle helmet, but when he wandered peacefully about the earth in human guise to see what men were doing, he generally donned a broad-brimmed hat, drawn low over his forehead to conceal the fact that he possessed but one eye. 2 ravens, Hunin, Thought, and Munin, Memory, perched upon his shoulders as he sat upon his throne, and these he sent out into the wide world every morning, anxiously watching for their return at nightfall, when they whispered into his ears news of all they had seen and heard. Thus he was kept well informed about everything that was happening on earth. Hunin and Munin fly each day over the spacious earth. I fear for Hunin that he come not back, yet more anxious am I for Munin. Norse mythology, R.B. Anderson. At his feet crouched 2 wolves or hunting hounds, Geri and Freki, animals which were therefore considered sacred to him, and of good omen if met by the way. Odin always fed these wolves with his own hands from meat set before him. He required no food at all for himself, and seldom tasted anything except the sacred mead. Geri and Freki, the war-wont states, the triumph sires of host, but on wine only, the famed in arms, Odin ever lives. Lay of Grimnir, Thorpe's translation. When seated in state upon his throne, Odin rested his foot upon a footstool of gold, the work of the gods, all of whose furniture and utensils were fashioned either of that precious metal or of silver. Beside the magnificent hall, Gladsheim, where stood the 12 seats occupied by the gods when they met in council, and Velskalf, where his throne, Hildskaf, was placed, Odin had a third place in Asgard, situated in the midst of the marvelous grove, Glacier, whose shimmering leaves were of red gold, Valhalla. This palace, called Valhalla, the Hall of the Chosen Slain, had 540 doors, wide enough to allow the passage of 800 warriors abreast, and above the principal gate were a boar's head and an eagle whose piercing glance penetrated to the far corners of the world. The walls of this marvelous building were fashioned of glittering spears, so highly polished that they illuminated the hall. The roof was of golden shields, and the benches were decorated with fine armor, the god's gifts to his guest. Here long tables afforded ample accommodation for the Einherjar warriors fallen in battle, who were specifically favored by Odin. Easily to be known is, by those who to Odin come, the mansion by its aspect, its roof with spears is laid, its hall with shields is decked, with corselets are its benches strewed. Lay of Grimnir, Thor's translation. The ancient northern nations, who deemed warfare the most honorable of occupations and considered courage the greatest virtue, worshipped Odin principally as god of battle and victory. They believed that whenever a fight was impending, he sent out as special attendants the shield, battle, or wish maidens called Valkyries, choosers of the slain, who selected from the dead warriors one half of their number, whom they bore on their fleet. Steeds over the quivering rainbow bridge Bifrost into Valhalla. Welcomed by Odin's son, Hermod and Bragi, the heroes were conducted to the foot of Odin's throne, where they received the praise due to their valor. When some special favor of the god was thus brought into Asgard, Valfather, father of the slain, as Odin was called when he presided over the warriors, would sometimes rise from his throne and in person bid him welcome at the great entrance gate, the feast of the heroes. Besides the glory of such distinction and enjoyment of Odin's beloved presence day after day, other more material pleasures awaited the warriors in Valhalla. Generous entertainment was provided for them at the lawn tables where the beautiful white-armed virgins, the Valkyries, having laid aside their armor and clad themselves in pure white robes, waited upon them with assiduous attention. These maidens, 9 in number, according to some authorities, brought the heroes great horns full of delicious mead, and set before them huge portions of boar's flesh, upon which they feasted heartily. The usual northern drink was beer or ale, but our ancestors fancied this beverage too coarse for the heavenly sphere. They therefore imagined that Valfather kept his table liberally supplied with mead or hydromel, which was daily furnished in great abundance by his she-goat Heidrun, who continuously browsed on the tender leaves and twigs on Lirad, Yggdrasil's topmost branch. Rash war and perilous battle their delight, and immature and red with glorious wounds, on peaceful death their choice, deriving hence a right to feast and drain immortal bowls. In Odin's hall, whose blazing roof resounds, the genuine uproar of those shades who fall, in desperate fight or by some brave attempt. Liberty, James Thomson. The meat upon which the Einherjar feasted was the flesh of the divine boar, Sehimnir, a marvelous beast daily slain by the cook, Andhrimnir, and boiled in the great cauldron, Eldhrimnir. But although Odin's guests had true northern appetites and gorged themselves to the full, there was always plenty of meat for all. Andhrimnir cooks in Eldhrimnir, Sehrimnir, 'tis the best of flesh, but few know what the Einherjars eat. Lay of Grimnir, Anderson's version. Moreover, the supply was exhaustless, for the boar always came to life again before the time of the next meal. This miraculous renewal of supplies in the larder was not the only wonderful occurrence in Valhalla, for it is related that the warriors, after having eaten and drank to satiety, always called for their weapons, armed themselves, and rode out into the great courtyard, where they fought against one another, repeating the feats of arms for which they were famed on earth, and recklessly dealing terrible wounds, which, however, were miraculously and completely healed as soon as the dinner horn sounded. All the chosen guests of Odin daily ply the trade of war. From the fields of festal fight, swift they ride in gleaming arms, and gaily at the board of gods quaff the cup of sparkling ale, and eat Hrimni's vaunted flesh. Valthurni's Mall West, Taylor's translation. Whole and happy at the sound of the horn, and bearing one another no grudge for a cruel thrust given and received, the Einherjar would ride gaily back to Valhalla to renew their feast in Odin's beloved presence, while the white-armed Valkyries with flying hair glided gracefully about, constantly filling their horns or their favorite drinking vessels, the skulls of their enemies, while the skalds sang of war and of stirring Viking forays. And all along they there are hacked and hewn, mid dust and groans, and limbs lopped off and blood. But all at night return to Odin's hall, woundless and fresh. Such lot is theirs in heaven. Balder dead, Matthew Arnold. Fighting and feasting thus, the heroes were said to spend their days in perfect bliss, while Odin delighted in their strength and number, which, however, he foresaw would not avail to prevent his downfall when the day of the last battle should dawn. As such pleasures were the highest a northern warrior's fancy could paint, it was very natural that all fighting men should love Odin, and early in life should dedicate themselves to his service. They vowed to die arms in hand, if possible, and even wounded themselves with their own spears when death drew near. If they had been unfortunate enough to escape death on the battlefield, and were threatened with straw death, as they called decease from old age or sickness. To Odin, then true fast, carves he fair runics, death runes cut deep on arms and his breast. Viking Tales of the Norse, R.B. Anderson. In reward for this devotion, Odin watched with special care over his favorites, giving them gifts, a magic sword, a spear, or a horse, and making them invincible until their last hour had come, when he himself appeared to claim or destroy the gift he had bestowed, and the Valkyries bore the heroes to Valhalla. He gave to Hermod a helm and corslet. And from him Sigmund a sword received. Lay of Hindla, Thorpe's translation. Sleipnir. When Odin took an active part in war, he generally rode his 8-footed gray steed Sleipnir and bore a white shield. His glittering spear flung over the heads of the combatants was the signal for the fray to commence, and he would dash into the midst of the ranks, shouting his war cry, "Odin has you all." And Odin donned his dazzling corslet with his helm of gold, and led the way on Sleipnir. Balder dead, Matthew Arnold. At times he used his magic bow, from which he would shoot 10 arrows at once, everyone invariably bringing down a foe. Odin was also supposed to inspire his favorite warriors with the renowned berserker rage, bearsark or shirt, which enabled them, although naked, weaponless and sore beset, to perform unheard of feats of valor and strength, and move about as with charmed lives. As Odin's characteristics, like the all-pervading elements, were multitudinous, so also were his names, of which he had no less than 200, almost all descriptive of some phase of his activities. He was considered the ancient god of seamen and of the wind. Mighty Odin, Norsemen's hearts we bend to thee, steer our barks all potent Woden, o'er the surging Baltic Sea. Vale. Odin as the wild hunt. Odin as wind god was pictured as rushing through mid-air on his 8-footed steed, from which originated the oldest northern riddle, which runs as follows. Who are the two who ride to the thing? 3 eyes have they together, 10 feet and 1 tail, and thus they travel through the lands. And as the souls of the dead were supposed to be wafted away on the wings of the storm, Odin was worshipped as the leader of all disembodied spirits. In this character, he was most generally known as the Wild Huntsman, and when people heard the rush and roar of the wind, they cried aloud in superstitious fear, fancying they heard and saw him ride past with his train, all mounted on snorting steeds and accompanied by baying hounds. and the passing of the wild hunt, known as Woden's hunt, the raging host, Gabriel's hounds, or Asgardrea, was also considered a presage a presage of such misfortune as pestilence or war. The Rhine flows bright, but its waves ere long must hear a voice of war, and a clash of spears our hills among, and a trumpet from afar. And the brave on a bloody turf must lie, for the huntsman hath gone by, the wild huntsman mishemened. It was further thought that if any were so sacrilegious as to join in the wild halloo and mockery, they would be immediately snatched up and whirled away with the vanishing host, while those who joined in the halloo with implicit good faith would be rewarded by the sudden gift of a horse's leg hurled at them from above, which, if carefully kept until the morrow, would be changed into a lump of gold. Even after the introduction of Christianity, the ignorant northern folk still dreaded the oncoming storm, declaring that it was the wild hunt sweeping across the sky. And oft times will start, for overhead are sweeping Gabriel's hounds. Doomed with their impious lord the flying hart, to chase forever on aerial grounds. Sonnet, Wordsworth. Sometimes it left behind a small black dog, which, cowering and whining upon a neighboring hearth, had to be kept for a whole year and carefully tended unless it could be exercised or frightened away. The usual recipe, the same as for the riddance of changelings, was to brew beer in eggshells, and this performance was supposed so to startle the spectral dog that he would fly with his tail between his legs, exclaiming that although as old as the Bamir or Bohemian forest, he had never before beheld such an uncanny sight. I am as old as the Bamir wold, and have in my life such a brewing not seen. Old saying, Thorpe's translation. The object of this phantom hunt varied greatly, and was either a visionary boar or a wild horse, white-breasted maidens who were caught and borne away, bound only once in 7 years, or the wood nymphs called moss maidens, who were thought to represent the autumn leaves torn from the trees and whirled away by the wintry gale. In the Middle Ages, when the belief in the old heathen deities were partly forgotten, the leader of the wild hunt was no longer Odin, but Charlemagne, Frederick Barbarossa, King Arthur, or some Sabbath breaker, like the Squire of Rodstein or Hans von Hackelberg, who in punishment for his sins was condemned to hunt forever through the realms of air. As the winds blew fiercest in autumn and winter, Odin was supposed to prefer hunting during that season, especially during the time between Christmas and the 12th night, and the peasants were always careful to leave the last sheaf or measure of grain out in the fields to serve as food for his horse. This hunt was, of course, known by various names in the different countries of northern Europe. But as the tales told about it are all alike, they evidently originated in the same old heathen belief, and to this day ignorant people of the north fancy that the baying of a hound on a stormy night is an infallible presage of death. Still shall last the dreadful chase. Time till itself shall have an end. By day they scour earth's cavern space, at midnight witching hour ascend. This is the horn, and hound, and hearse, that oft the late peasants heard. Appalled he signs the frequent cross, when the wild din invades his ears. The wakeful priest oft drops a tear, for human pride, for human woe, when at his midnight mass he hears the infernal cry of Holla Ho. Sir Walter Scott. The wild hunt or raging host of Germany was called Herlethane in England, from the mythical king Herla, its supposed leader. In northern France it bore the name of Mesne de Heliquin, from Hel, goddess of death, and in the Middle Ages it was known as Cain's Hunt or Herod's Hunt, whose latter names being given because the leaders were supposed to be unable to find rest on account of the inquisitous murders of Abel, of John the Baptist, and of the Holy Innocents. In central France, the wild huntsmen, whom we have already seen in other countries as Odin, Charlemagne, Barbarossa, Rodstein, von Hackelberg, King Arthur, Hel, one of the sweetest kings, Gabriel, Cain, or Herod, is also called the great huntsman of Fontainebleau, Le Grand Veneur de Fontainebleau. And people declared that on the eve of Henry V's murder, and also just before the outbreak of the Great French Revolution, his shouts were distinctly heard as he swept across the sky. It was generally believed among the northern nations that the soul escaped from the body in the shape of a mouse, which crept out of a corpse's mouth and ran away, and it was also said to creep in and out of the mouths of people in a trance. While the soul was absent, no effort or remedy could recall the patient to life. But as soon as it had come back, animation returned. The Pied Piper. As Odin was the leader of all disembodied spirits, he was identified in the Middle Ages with the Pied Piper of Hamelin. According to medieval legends, Hamelin was so infested by rats that life became unbearable, and a large reward was offered to any who would rid the town of these rodents. A piper in party-colored garments offered to undertake the commission, and the terms being accepted, he commenced to play through the streets in such wise that, one and all, the rats were beguiled out of their holes until they formed a vast procession. That was that and the strains which compelled them to follow, until at last the river Weser was reached, and all were drowned in its tide. And ere 3 shrill notes the pipe uttered, you heard as if an army muttered. And the muttering grew to a grumbling, and the grumbling grew to a mighty rumbling, and out of the houses the rats came tumbling. Great rats, small rats, lean rats, brawny rats, brown rats, black rats, gray rats, tawny rats. Grave old plodders, gay young friskers, fathers, mothers, uncles, cousins, cocking tails and pricking whiskers, families by tens and dozens, brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, followed the piper for their lives. From street to street he piped advancing, and step for step they followed dancing, until they came to the river Weser, wherein all plunged and perished. Robert Browning. As the rats were all dead, and there was no chance of their returning to plague them, the people of Hamelin refused to pay their reward, and they bade the piper do his worst. He took them at their word, and a few moments later the weird strains of the magic flute again rose, and this time it was the children who swarmed out of the houses and merrily followed the piper. There was a rustling that seemed like a bustling, of merry crowds justling at pitching and hustling. Small feet were pattering, wooden shoes clattering, little hands clapping and little tongues chattering. And like fowls in a farmyard when barley is scattering, out came all the children running, all the little boys and girls, with rosy cheeks and flaxen curls, and sparkling eyes and teeth like pearls. Tripping and skipping ran merrily after the wonderful music with shouting and laughter. Robert Browning. The burghers were powerless to prevent the tragedy, and as they stood spellbound, the piper led the children out of the town to Koppelberg, a hill on the confines of the town, which miraculously opened to receive the procession and only closed again when the last child had passed out of sight. This legend probably originated the adage to pay the piper. The children were never seen in Hamelin again, and in commemoration of this public calamity, all official decrees have since been dated so many years after the Pied Piper's visit. They made a decree that lawyers never should think their records dated duly, if after the day of the month and year these words did not as well appear. And so long after what happened here on the 22nd of July, 1376, am the better in memory to fix, the place of children's last retreat. They called it the Pied Piper Street, where anyone playing on pipe or tabor was sure for the future to lose his labor. Robert Browning. In this myth, Odin is the piper, the shrill tones of the flute as emblematic of the whistling wind. The rats represent the souls of the dead, which cheerfully followed him, and the hollow mountain into which he leads the children is typical of the grave. Bishop Hatto. Another German legend which owes its existence to this belief is the story of Bishop Hatto, the miserly prelate who, annoyed by the clamors of the poor during a time of famine, had them buried alive in a deserted barn, like the rats whom he declared they resemble, rather than give them some of the precious grain which he had laid up for himself. Ay, faith, 'tis an excellent bonfire, quoth he, and the country is greatly obliged to me, for ridding it in these times forlorn of rats that only consume the corn. Robert Southey. Soon after this terrible crime had been accomplished, the bishop's retainers reported the approach of a vast swarm of rats. These, it appears, were the souls of the murdered peasants, which had assumed the forms of the rats to which the bishop had likened them. His efforts to escape were vain, and the rats pursued him even in the middle of the Rhine, to a stone tower in which he took refuge from their fangs. They swam to the tower, gnawed their way through the stone walls, and pouring in on all sides at once, they found the bishop and devoured him alive. And in at the windows and in at the door, and through the walls, helter-skelter they pour. And down from the ceiling and up through the floor, from the right and the left, from behind and before, from within and without, from above and below, and all at once to the bishop they go. They have whetted their teeth against the stones, and now they pick the bishop's bones. They gnawed the flesh from every limb, for they were sent to do judgment on him. Robert Southey. The red glow of the sunset above the rat tower near Bingen on the Rhine is supposed to be the reflection of the hellfire in which the wicked bishop is slowly roasting in punishment for his heinous crime. Ermin. In some parts of Germany, Odin was considered to be identical with the Saxon god Ermin, whose statue, the Irminsul near Paderborn, was destroyed by Charlemagne in 772. Ermin was said to possess a ponderous brazen chariot in which he rode across the sky along the path which we know as the Milky Way, but which the ancient Germans designated as Ermin's Way. This chariot, whose rumbling sound occasionally became perceptible to mortal ears as thunder, never left the sky, where it can still be seen in the constellation of the Great Bear, which is also known in the north as Odin's or Charles Wain. The Wain who wheels on high, his circling course, and on Orion waits. Sole star that never bathes in the ocean wave. Homer's Iliad, Derby's translation. Mimir's well. To obtain the great wisdom for which he is so famous, Odin, in the morn of time, visited Mimir's memory spring, the fountain of all wit and wisdom. In those liquid depths, even the future was clearly mirrored, and besought the old man who guarded it to let him have a draught. But Mimir, who well knew the value of such a favor, for his spring was considered the source or headwater of memory, refused the boon unless Odin could consent to give one of his eyes in exchange. The god did not hesitate, so highly did he prize the draught, but immediately plucked out one of his eyes, which Mimir kept in pledge, sinking it deep down into his fountain, where it shone with mild luster, leaving Odin with but one eye, which is considered emblematic of the sun. Through our whole lives we strive towards the sun. That burning forehead is the eye of Odin. His second eye, the moon, shines not so bright. It was he placed in pledge in Mimir's fountain, that he may fetch the healing waters thence, each morning for the strengthening of this eye. Olenslager Howitt's translation. Drinking deeply of Mimir's fount, Odin gained the knowledge he coveted, and never regretted the sacrifice he had made. But as further memorial of that day, broke off a branch of the sacred tree Yggdrasil, which overshadowed the spring, and fashioned from it his beloved spear, Gungnir. A dauntless god drew for drink to its gleam, where he left in endless payment the light of an eye from the world ash. Ere Wotan went, he broke a bough. For a spear the staff, he split with strength from the stem. Dusk of the Gods, Wagner, Foreman's translation. But although Odin was now all-wise, he was sad and oppressed, for he had gained an insight into futurity and had become aware of the transitory nature of all things, and even of the fate of the gods, who were doomed to pass away. This knowledge so affected his spirits that he ever after wore a melancholy and contemplative expression. To test the value of the wisdom he had thus obtained, Odin went to visit the most learned of all the giants, Vafthrûdnir, and entered with him into a contest of wits, in which the stake was nothing less than the loser's head. Odin rose with speed and went to contend in runic lore. With the wise and crafty Ute, to Vafthrûdnir's royal halls came the mighty king of spells. Vafthrûdnir's Maul, Taylor's translation. Odin and Vafthrûdnir. On this occasion, Odin had disguised himself as a wanderer by Frigga's advice, and when asked his name, declared it was Gangrad. The contest of wit immediately began. Valthrunr questioning his guest concerning the horses which carry day and night across the sky, the river Ifim separating Jotunheim from Asgard, and also about Vigdrid, the field where the last battle was to be fought. All these questions were minutely answered by Odin, who then, Valfnir had ended, began the interrogatory in his turn, and received equally explicit answers about the origin of heaven and earth, their creation of the gods, their quarrel with the Vanas, the occupations of the heroes in Valhalla, the offices of the Norns, and the rulers who were to replace the Aesir when they had all perished with the world they had created. But when in conclusion Odin bent near the giant and softly inquired what words Allfather whispered to his dead son Balder as he lay upon his funeral pyre, Valfnir suddenly recognized his divine visitor. Starting back in dismay, he declared that no one but Odin himself could answer that question, and that it was now quite plain to him that he had madly striven in a contest of wisdom and wit with the king of the gods, and fully deserved the penalty of failure, the loss of his head. Not the man of mortal race knows the words which thou hast spoken to thy son in days of yore. I hear the coming tread of death. He soon shall raise the runic lore, and knowledge of the rise of gods, from his ill-fated soul who strove with Odin's self the strife of wit. Wisest of the wise that breathe, our stake was life, and thou hast won. Valfnir's Maul, W. Taylor's translation. As is the case with so many of the northern myths, which are often fragmentary and obscure, this one ends here, and none of the skalds informs us whether Odin really slew his rival, nor what was the answer to his last question. But mythologists have hazarded the suggestion that the word whispered by Odin in Balder's ear to console him for his untimely death must have been resurrection. Invention of runes. Besides being god of wisdom, Odin was god and inventor of runes, the earliest alphabet used by northern nations, which characters signifying mystery were at first used for divination, although in later times they served for inscriptions and records. Just as wisdom could only be obtained at the cost of sacrifice, Odin himself relates that he hung 9 days and nights from the sacred tree Yggdrasil, gazing down into the immeasurable depths of Niflheim, plunged in deep thought and self-wounded with his spear, ere he won the knowledge he sought. I know that I hung on a wind-rock tree 9 whole nights with a spear wounded, and to Odin offered myself to myself on that tree, of which no one knows from what root it springs. Odin's Rune Song, Thorpe's translation. When he had fully mastered this knowledge, Odin cut magic runes upon his spear Gungnir, upon the teeth of his horse Sleipnir, upon the claws of the bear, and upon countless other animate and inanimate things. And because he had thus hung over the abyss for such a long space of time, he was ever after considered the patron divinity of all who were condemned to be hanged or who perished by the noose. After obtaining the gift of wisdom and runes, which gave him power over all things, Odin also coveted the gift of eloquence and poetry, which he acquired in a manner which we shall relate in a subsequent chapter. Geirrod and Agnar. Odin, as has already been stated, took great interest in the affairs of mortals, and we are told was specifically fond of watching King Hroðdin's handsome little sons, Geirrod and Agnar, that when they were about 8 and 10 years of age respectively. One day these little lads went fishing, and a storm suddenly arose which blew their boat far out to sea, where it finally stranded upon an island, upon which dwelt a seeming old couple, who in reality were Odin and Frigga in disguise. They had assumed these forms in order to indulge a sudden passion for the close society of their proteges. The lads were warmly welcomed and kindly treated, Odin choosing Geirrod as his favorite and teaching him the use of arms, while Frigga petted and made much of little Agnar. The boys tarried on the island with their kind protectors during the long cold winter season. But when spring came and the skies were blue and the sea calm, they embarked in a boat which Odin provided and set out for their native shore. Favored by gentle breezes, they were soon after thither. But as the boat neared the strand, Geirrod quickly sprang out and pushed it far back into the water, bidding his brothers sail away into the evil spirit's power. At that same moment, At that self-same moment the wind veered, and Agnar was indeed carried away, while his brother hastened to his father's palace with a lying tale as to what had happened to his brother. He was joyfully received as one from the dead, and in due time he succeeded his father upon the throne. Years passed by, during which the attention of Odin had been claimed by other high considerations, when one day, while the divine couple were seated on the throne, Hilskalf, Odin, suddenly remembered the winter's sojourn on the desert island, and he bade his wife notice how powerful his pupil had become, and taunted her because her favorite Agnar had married a giantess and had remained poor, and of no consequence. Frigga quietly replied that it was better to be poor than hard-hearted, and accused Geirröd of lack of hospitality, one of the most heinous crimes in the eyes of a Northman. She even went so far as to declare that in spite of all his wealth, he often ill-treated his guest. When Odin heard this accusation, he declared that he would prove the falsity of the charge by assuming the guise of a wanderer and testing Geirröd's generosity. Wrapped in his cloud-hued raiment, with slouch hat and pilgrim staff, Wanderer calls me the world. Far have I carried my feet on the back of the earth. I have boundlessly been. Wagner, Foreman's translation. Odin immediately sent out by a roundabout way, while Frigga, to outwit him, immediately dispatched a swift messenger to warn Geirröd to beware of a man in wide mantle and broad-brimmed hat, as he was a wicked enchanter who would work him ill. When, therefore, Odin presented himself before the king's palace, he was dragged into Geirröd's presence and questioned roughly. He gave his name as Grimnir, but refused to tell whence he came or what he wanted. So at this, reticence confirmed the suspicion suggested to the mind of Geirröd. He allowed his love of cruelty full play, and commanded that the stranger should be bound between two fires in such wise that the flames played around him without quite touching him, and he remained thus 8 days and nights in obstinate silence without food. Now Agnar had returned secretly to his brother's palace, where he occupied a menial position, and one night, when all was still, in pity for the suffering of the unfortunate captive, he conveyed to his lips a horn of ale. But for this Odin would have nothing to drink, the most serious of all trials to the god. And at the end of the 8th day, while Geirröd, seated upon his throne, was gloating over his prisoner's sufferings, Odin began to sing, softly at first, then louder and louder, until the hall re-echoed with his triumphant notes, a prophecy that the king who had so long enjoyed the god's favor would soon perish by his own sword. The fallen by the sword ye shall now have. Thy life is now run out. Wroth with thee are the Disir. Odin, thou now shalt see. Draw near to me if thou canst. Samud's Edda, Thorpe's translation. As the last notes died away, the chains dropped from his hands, the flames flickered and went out, and Odin stood in the midst of the hall, no longer in human form, but in all the power and beauty of a god. On hearing the ominous prophecy, Geirröd hastily drew his sword, intending to slay the insolent singer, but when he beheld the sudden transformation, he startled in dismay, tripped, fell upon the sharp blade, and perished as Odin had just foretold. Turning to Agnar, who according to some accounts was the king's son, and not his brother, for those old stories are often strangely confused, Odin bade him ascend the throne in reward for his humanity, and further to repay him for the timely draw of ale. He promised to bless him with all manner of prosperity. On another occasion, Odin wandered to earth, and was absent so long that the gods began to think that they would not see him in Asgard again. This encouraged his brother Villian, who by some mythologists are considered as other personifications of himself, to usurp his power and his throne, and even, we are told, to espouse his wife Frigga. Be thou silent, Frigg, thou art Figorn's daughter, and ever hast been fond of men. Since Vean Vile, it is said, thou Vidri's wife didst both to thy bosom take. Samud's Edda, Thorpe's translation. Okay guys, I'm going to stop there. I'm still going to continue on with chapter 2 in another video. So if you liked this video, please go ahead and leave comments below. Don't forget to like my channel and like this video. And again, if you have any questions about what I have read, leave them down below in the comments and I will go ahead and answer them in the next video before I continue on with chapter 2. Thank you guys for watching if you did, and I will see you guys next time at Norse Pagan Corner. Thank you.